I'm just shedding a lot of hair. I don't really have any noticeable bald spots or a real recession in my hairline yet. Dr. Orenreich was offering me hair transplant surgery, and he told me that, look, even if you were my own son, I would tell you to try a few. That's kind of what was a red flag to me when he told me to try a few. And I said to him, well, where are you going to put it? He said, well, we'll start in front of your current hairline. So as you continue to recede, no one's going to notice. And I'm taking a look at even his before and after images, and I'm noticing that.
If you want to know who one of the original patient influencers were for hair transplants, it would have to be Spencer Kobren. Spencer Kobren has been advocating and protecting patients when it comes to hair loss and hair transplants for over 20 years. He's gone on to found the American Hair Loss Association, and he's also a podcast host for The Bold Truth. He's one of my good colleagues and friends, and together we talked about how patients can better navigate their journey when it comes to their hair loss. Most people don't wake up one day and decide to dedicate their lives to hair loss advocacy. What was that moment that made you say, hey, I have to get involved?
Well, I'll try to make this as short as possible, but I started to notice my hair loss around 21, 22 years old. Freaked me out. We're talking about the late 1980s. Hair meant a lot. It meant a lot to me because, at least at that time, for whatever reason, that was something that people would comment on a lot. So, being a young person, getting attention from women about something, about your hair, and then all of a sudden realizing this is changing, it really affected me. And so I decided to try to do my research, but it was very difficult back then. The only thing that we really had there were some infomercials that kind of started actually a little later than the late 80s, but stuff in the back of magazines, sports pages. I was living in New York at the time. And so I just took all the regular routes. I went to the hair club, and I went to, guys like Norman Orenreich and all the guys that were kind of renowned in the field, especially coming from New York. These are the people that we heard about. And I recognized pretty early on that something wasn't right. I had the wherewithal to kind of understand that, well, wait a second. I'm just shedding a lot of hair. I don't really have any noticeable bald spots or a real recession in my hairline yet. Dr. Orenreich was offering me hair transplant surgery, and he told me that, look, even if you were my own son, I would tell you to try a few. That's kind of what was a red flag to me when he told me to try a few. And I said to him, well, where are you going to put it? He said, well, we'll start in front of your current hairline. So as you continue to recede, no one's going to notice. And I'm taking a look at even his before and after images, and I'm noticing that it was pretty stocky at the time. We're talking about 4mm plugs. And even though I was a young entrepreneur. I had the money to do it. It was $25 a graft. I'll never forget this. And I could have done it, like these kids, they go in for premature surgery now. But something stopped me. Also, Hair Club wanted to sell me a wig. If you would have seen me during this consultation, it would have been hilarious. I mean, I had to essentially make the salesperson sweat until they finally told me what they were selling me. They wouldn't admit that it was a wig. And then finally, I'm like, where are you going to put it? So I had all this experience, and it was not great. And again, to try to make a long story short, in 1994, I read an article.
By the way, this sounds like this was the Midwest, the Wild West, I should say.
Absolutely the Wild West. Not much has changed, as you probably know. But, I mean, it really was the Wild West back in the day because there was no information out there. You had to do all of your research by, doing your own legwork. And if you were young and impressionable, and I was vulnerable, but it's possibly because I was already in business as a young person. I've had some experiences with BS artists, and I just knew something was not right. I was able to step back and say, look, let me take my time, continue to do my research. I read an article in the New York Times about a drug that was being tested. It was currently being prescribed for benign prostate hyperplasia. It's a tough one for me to say.
Sounds like finasteride.
Yeah, BPH, yeah. And it was, the name of the drug at the time was Proscar. That was the brand name. And one of the side effects, besides the ones that we hear about now, was that people were actually growing their hair back. And they were considering testing it or starting trials for male pattern hair loss. I got this article. I brought it to a doctor, a friend of the family. And I said, listen, brother, you got to get me this drug. Tell me about this. So he looked it up in the physician's desk reference. He's like, pretty safe. I mean, you could have some adverse sexual side effects possibly, but, given all the other drugs that are being prescribed, it's one of the safest drugs in the PDR. I got myself on the drug. Had no adverse side effects. Wasn't even thinking about it. Essentially, I had almost a cessation of hair loss within 2 or 3 months. I noticed that my overall thinning started to reverse. My hair got thicker on the sides and the back. The crown was growing back in, which I was starting to lose a little bit. And I wasn't losing any more in the hairline. It basically just stopped it in its tracks. And I had tried minoxidil before it was approved as Rogaine. I had a compounding pharmacy compounded for me. It was a whole thing. And I know this is a long story, but
No, but
I decided
I'll tell you something interesting. It sounds like you were an early adopter, and it comes
yes.
from your entrepreneurial spirit to try something where other people weren't really kind of exploring using that drug yet for hair loss. It sounds like you were very aggressive in terms of trying to address your hair loss at a young age.
Well, I was, and I will tell you that, after kind of getting some information from Merck after I started my show and stuff, uh, I realized I was probably one of the first people, young men, to use finasteride specifically for hair loss outside of clinical trials. So I guess in that respect, I was a pioneer, or just I mean, it upset me so much that I was willing to do anything. Let's put it that way. So,
And by the way, that's the typical story of a young male who's afraid about losing their hair. They really want to try anything. And sometimes I see a lot of men in their early 20s who are consulting with us, and they want hair transplants. And I'm like, wait a second, slow down. I know they're doing great marketing on TikTok and Instagram, but you have to start on hair loss medication. I mean, that's the first place that I think that patients really have to start their hair loss journey.
well, they're lucky to find you, let's put it that way, because that is not the mantra online or in the new hair transplant world. But just to finish my story real quick, I took all that information. I'm like, you know what? No one was there to help me. I have no one to talk about this with. There was no guidance. I'm going to write about this, and so I decided to write a book. And I had never been published before. I've never even thought about writing a book before. But I had all this information in my head. I'm like, let me see if I could share this with the world. I found an agent after I wrote the initial manuscript, and we could not sell the book. I was turned down by essentially it was 33 publishers, 14 agents initially, 33 publishers. Finally got the last agent, who was balding and relatively young. He said, yeah, I like this. I had agents that said, well, you can't write. We're going to have to hire you a ghostwriter. I'm like, just give me an editor. It was a very difficult process back in the day. In December of 1997, Propecia was approved for hair loss. And that was after everyone turned down my book because I wasn't a doctor. All of a sudden, the phone started to ring. So we had Simon & Schuster, Warner Books, Little Brown Books, and it kind of started a little bidding war for my little book, The Bald Truth. And that's how I got into this. I just wanted to share my information with the world and let people know this is a dirty industry. If I could have made a lot of mistakes and I didn't, this new drug, changed my life. And I wanted to share that with people. And that's
How
how I
did you
started.
discover that this was at least in the early days, why you felt it was a dirty industry?
I thought it was a dirty industry because I knew that I wasn't a candidate for hair transplant surgery. It didn't make any sense to put 4 millimeter plugs in front of a pretty good looking hairline because I was just shedding hair. I was also offered progesterone injections into my scalp and other things that I just thought it didn't make sense to me. I know that Norman Orentreich is revered in the industry as, the guy that reinvented hair transplant surgery, and he has like a legacy of the, family legacy. But the reality is, at least in my time, these guys and guys like him were doing a lot of damage, a lot of bad work being done. The walking wounded was really severe. And I felt it was irresponsible for a man who was at that time, probably in his 40s or 50s, to advise a 22-year-old boy, essentially, to disfigure himself. And I felt that's what it would be. right away. It made no sense. And then when these guys from the hair club wanted to sell me a wig, and basically I would have had to shave all my hair off to put this fake hair on. And their rationale was, well, no one will ever know as you continue to lose your hair, just like the transplants. And then there were companies selling, you know, I don't know if you know, you're probably too young for this, but the Helsinki formula and all these different things on television. And everything was a scam. I tried everything. I hung upside down, put cayenne pepper in my hair. I took the advice. I bought hypnosis tapes, hair loss hypnosis tapes.
Wow,
I did
it
everything.
sounds like you've tried everything. I got to be honest.
Yeah,
Um,
I was one of those guys.
do you think it's worse now than it was before? Because now we have access to mass media right here on these phones,
Yes.
that with very very targeted content with algorithms. Do you think that there's a lot of young people that are being taken advantage of?
Yeah, I think it's the same, but it's been scaled to a proportion that I could never have imagined. And I would say that there's a couple of differences besides the fact that it's looked at as a simple fix for young people, especially at the surgical side of things. At least back in the day, there was a barrier to entry. You had to be able to afford hair transplant surgery, and that kind of knocked a lot of the young guys out of the picture. So they had to wait and try to save their money, unless they had parents who were willing to pay for it, or unless they were like a young person like me who started to earn money at a young age. But that was pretty rare. So I think that barrier to entry really saved a lot of guys. Now there's no barrier. Now
Okay,
you
so
can,
what you're saying is back in the 90s, 80s and 90s when they started doing hair transplants, it was too expensive. So you had to
right.
be in your 40s, your 50s, you had to have the disposable income to have these hair transplants. It wasn't like you were getting a hair transplant for $2,000 or $3,000. That was those type of transplants did not exist yet.
That's exactly right. And also just the sheer volume of information. You know, when you were losing your hair back in the day, you really had to do your legwork. You really had to be motivated to even consider doing something about your hair loss. Now it's in everybody's feed. If someone just decides to look up or stumble upon one influencer who had a hair transplant or decide to use some sort of, derma roller or rosemary oil, they are inundated with this information. And they're thinking to themselves, well, wait a second, I don't want to lose my hair either. Let me do something about it. So it's presented now as an easy fix, and it's presented now as you have a choice between maybe medication or natural products, or just going to Turkey, for instance, to get a hair transplant, and you can fix your problem. And again, we see more walking wounded from this industry now to levels that I never thought that I would see. Essentially, I retired in 2009. I no longer had to work for a living. 2009. The radio show, FM talk stations kind of went out of business, and I was on FM talk across the country and some AM stations. Howard Stern went over to Sirius XM. I made a decision like, do I want to continue to do this, or do I want to relax a little bit and kind of enjoy my life?
Well,
The
maybe you got
online
sick of
world,
talking about hair too. That's
well,
also a possibility.
part of it, but also what I got sick of most is as the online world started to evolve, the nastiness. Like I was always not well liked in the industry because I exposed the truth. So I, your industry tried to cancel me before cancel culture even existed. And it was pretty nasty what went down. Lawsuits, like really, underhanded stuff online. Um, Large chain clinics really tried to come after me, and obviously I was able to deal with that and fend them off. But I decided, it's a little bit of a hassle. I'm going to relax a little bit. I'll still stay relevant. I'll put out a live stream on other people's resources. I'll flip on my camera, whatever it is. But I didn't have to work, so I decided not to. And I traveled and lived my life and did some day drinking and just enjoyed myself while I was young. Um, but a couple of years ago, especially during the pandemic, everyone was going crazy. There was so much misinformation out there. I thought it was a good opportunity to kind of get back in, and I did something called the Global Hair Loss Summit, which was the first
So,
really.
so wait, for clarification, you took a 10-year hiatus.
Essentially, I mean, as far as like having to work in the industry every day and, go to a radio station and do my show, I wasn't doing any writing or anything like that. I would turn on the camera and you could still see podcasts online or live streams that are podcasts online, but I wasn't actively putting up podcasts like on my own resources or anything like that. So I'd turn on the camera once a week, show my face, and excuse me, say hi to everybody, answer some questions, and then live the rest of my life. So basically, it was about 10 years, something like that. Yeah.
So then you came back during the pandemic when there was a flood of people getting a tremendous amount of misinformation on the internet. That's when you saw an opportunity to kind of reintroduce yourself and try to save a lot of people.
Well, that's right, and also the industry was kind of floundering. I saw what was happening to the industry itself. My organizations were still in existence. Excuse me, and so I saw the physicians who were part of the International Alliance of Hair Restoration Surgeons. All of a sudden, they're concerned about what's happening in Turkey and what's happening in India, and they really have no guidance. Your trade organizations really don't do much for your field in that respect. They were unable to go to a conference at the time because of the pandemic, so I decided to put on something called the Global Hair Loss Summit, and it was really successful. We were able to bring people in from all disciplines, from the American Academy of Dermatology and cosmetic surgeons, board-certified plastic surgeons, facial plastic surgeons. Everyone got involved. They gave us their IP to present online. It was great. We made it very inexpensive for physicians to become, to be part of it. We developed it as an online conference that kind of looked like something that, everyone's used to consuming content now, like through Netflix or Amazon. So we wanted to create something that looked and felt like that, and we did. Got a lot of backlash from the politicians in the industry because they were putting on their own conference, the ISHRS, and there were people who were told not to present at our conference, pretty nutty stuff. But I still felt it was really important. Long story short, it was a success. And when I saw that happening, a lot of the doctors were contacting me saying, look, we've got to figure out something. How are we going to get the good information back out to the public? And I decided to kind of get back into it. And pretty recently, just in October, I started to put a little bit of effort into Instagram. So I grew that following from a very small following of maybe, 10, 12,000 and 18,000, something like that, to about close to 100, I think 42,000 today in just a couple of months.
It just shows how much interest is out there in terms of like getting the truth about hair restoration, hair transplants, and how there really there's a strong appetite to consume that information.
There is. The problem is consumers don't understand the difference between hype and the truth. And it's very difficult to provide them with the truth without, it sounds obnoxious, but you really have to dumb it down and somehow just get their attention. And I find myself, when I just put out a reel of like me in the studio taking a call, doesn't do well. But if I like open up, my refrigerator door and have a camera in there and say something really, like a quick hook to get them in, then maybe I get the opportunity to provide them with some education, and then I'll send them to an article from the American Hair Loss Association to read. That seems to be working. I see the problems exist with you doctors trying to put yourself out there online. Straight education doesn't work. You have to find a hook with these kids, and then maybe they'll listen to you if you're lucky.
So talk to me about your perspective on the pros and cons of, let's say, hair surgeons creating content on the internet for an audience where, in some cases they want to either monetize that audience because they want to perform hair transplants for those patients. So you could say that the incentive to create content is kind of mixed, right? They want to educate, but there's also an incentive to drum up some new business. What is your perspective? What's your take?
Well, I mean, that's the right perspective. Your perspective is my perspective. But the thing is, what you start to see happening is there are people who may start off innocently enough They may hire a company to help them. They know they need to be online in order to compete in this crazy market. Can't just be a doctor anymore. You have to be a content creator in order to survive and thrive in this field. And that's medicine across the board at this point, or a lot of medicine, especially in the cosmetic space. What I see is most physicians online are forced to omit a lot of the truths. Otherwise, they're not going to get people in their chair. They don't provide people with full disclosure. They don't discuss the realities and the nuances of hair transplant surgery. They really go after the low-hanging fruit. They concentrate on maybe doing reaction videos on celebrities and things of that nature. I mean, and there's some guys who have done very well doing that. And there's some guys who come across as being very kind, very generous with their time, very just well informed about what's going on in the field. And then you come to realize a lot of these guys don't even have any time on tissue. Maybe they did a pre-turnship. Maybe they've been in the industry for 5 years. And then they kind of caught fire online. So they're spending so much time in front of the camera, they're not spending as much time on tissue.
Performing surgery, yeah.
Yeah, and they are having their staff perform a lot of the surgery. They're able to charge top dollar because of their online presence. And then when you see their work, you're like, this is pretty questionable stuff. Yet, based on their personality and their presence, they're able to convince patients that they are somehow leaders in the field. So I think it's a very slippery slope for the hair loss consumer. I would say in general.
Look, I want to say one thing first. I think you're completely correct. Results don't lie. I think at the end of the day, if you are searching for a hair surgeon, the first thing, yes, you got to trust the doctor. The safety of the patient is paramount, but then you got to look at results, and you got to make sure that you really look at the results that they've accomplished, and look at the extent of how long they've been practicing to kind of determine, is this a reputable person to go to get my transplant?
I think that's well said. The problem lies with the sad reality that today's hair transplant consumer, they don't really understand what they're looking at. There has been this new normal created by the hair transplant tourism world and other people even here in the U.S. of these very low, straight, unrefined hairlines. Grafts are being placed via FUE, being extracted via FUE and just placed back into the scalp. Two hair grafts, 3 hair grafts, or unrefined grafts. Doctors aren't even using microscopes to refine some of these grafts anymore. And we would look at these results as pluggy, unnatural results. The consumer now thinks this is what a hair transplant is supposed to look like. Kind of like, these young women now are aspiring to have these unnatural looking lips. That it's not something that we see in nature, yet these women are aspiring to have this. So there's a real confusion. People don't understand the difference between a natural hairline, what a hair transplant is supposed to look like, the limitations of hair transplant surgery, the importance of maintaining and utilizing the donor bank and reserving that donor bank for future surgeries. This is something it's really not discussed. And the biggest influencers, even if they're good guys, they're avoiding that discussion because they know that gives consumers something more to think about. And they may not walk through their doors, or they may not sign on a dotted line if they're told the truth. So you're right. Results count. Results are what matter. But a lot of people don't even know what they're looking at.
You bring up an interesting point, and I'm going to counter it very slightly. Okay.
Yeah.
If you are an influencer or a doctor influencer, you're gonna be booked out enough months where you're not going to care about the next patient coming in or if they're going to cancel. And so when I think about creating content, I think and I'm just talking about myself, but I think this is relevant to other people creating content as well, if they're really truly honest. Dispelling things that are incorrect, telling the truth, and being honest, and trying to educate patients about what they should and shouldn't do, I think is vitally important. So I'll give you an example. I've made videos talking about Turkey, and I do think there are probably some very reputable hair surgeons in Turkey, but there's obviously a lot of terrible things that happen in Turkey. And
There's
I'm
about
not going
10.
to, I'm sure. But my when I think about talking about Turkey on social media, I don't say necessarily don't go to Turkey. I want to make sure that those patients are very informed about what they're doing so that they can make the right educated decisions for themselves. So my only counter to what you said is that I think at some point, yes, I think initially when you get on the internet and you start to talk on Instagram, it's about bringing in patients. I think that happens. You're correct about that. But I think there's a turning point, a transition point where, okay, now my schedule's booked out for the next 2 or 3 months. I have all the surgeries kind of lined up. Now I'm not really worried about my next patient coming in the door. What I then think about is how can I do a better job at telling the truth? Because I think at the end of the day, patients are going to want, there's more respect, if that makes sense. There's a bigger incentive to be an advocate for patients once you get to a certain scale.
I agree with that, and that was a very well stated point. But you also made the point that this is what you do in your practice, and when you create content, this isn't necessarily what other physician content creators are doing, sadly. And I don't want to counter that point, but also there's also a school of thought that even if you're booked out for a year, that doesn't last forever. So you need to keep that going. And as you continue to create content, you're going to see different variables of response to that content. And as you start really providing full disclosure, you will notice some pushback in your comment section. You will notice people arguing with the truth and saying, well, you don't even know what you're talking about because I went to this doctor so-and-so, and he said he can give me 7,000 grafts doing this technique and using a sapphire blade and using this and that, and why aren't you doing this? And so it's, the consumer and the viewers make it that much more difficult for doctors to be honest as well. So it's not just necessarily the doctor's fault or the doctor's, they're not necessarily doing it just to be dishonest or just to avoid telling the truth, but sometimes telling the truth makes their job more difficult and their content creation more difficult because they have to fight these consumers, if that makes sense.
100%,
I know
yes.
that happens to me all the time. Me telling the truth online, I get so much pushback from people who are like, well, what do you say? Are you just selling medication? I don't sell anything. That's what I tell them. Or, well, when I try to explain the long-term ramifications of these giga sessions and the reality that, the theory of donor dominance has been thrown out the window to some degree with 100% FUE surgeries, and that you really need to be on medication if this is the path that you're choosing. Otherwise, those grafts can miniaturize as well, some of them. You cannot take 100% of the DHT resistant, and it's not even 100% DHT resistant, grafts out of a person's scalp unless you perform at least 1 or 2 strips. That's just the reality of it. So there has to be a concession, and you have to understand what it means when you're having these procedures done. These kids don't want to hear it. And then they start arguing about, well, this is state of the art, and what you're talking about is archaic, and there's no middle ground or nuance that people understand in the online world.
So what guidance do you give people in terms of helping them choose the right hair surgeon?
Well, listen, I founded the International Alliance of Hair Restoration Surgeons back in 2001. I'm sorry, 2001, 2002. Jesus.
Over 20 years ago.
Over 20 years ago. Because at the time, it was a lot easier back then. There were doctors who were willing to do pure follicular unit hair transplant surgery using stereomicroscopic dissection, cut the size blades, things of that nature, really improving the infrastructure of their practices to provide patients with the most natural results. And there were only a handful of doctors who were willing to do that. In 1998, there were 11. By the time I started the organization, there were probably about 30. Once the organization took off, it changed the industry completely. Everyone started to adopt the use of stereomicroscopic dissection, and everyone was trying to at least promote that in their practice. They weren't doing it well, but so at the time, it was easy for me to say, okay, this is the group of doctors to go to. Now, as things evolved and the organization, I mean, I can't even grow it because.
By the way, do you blame the organizations for not setting very clear standards and qualifications for why the quality is it's all over the place?
It's interesting. The word blame it's an interesting term to use, and I would say that I used to use the term blame. I just think that a lot of physicians who decide to get into this field, there are a group of physicians who really love what they do, and they understand the value and the profound importance that this incredibly elegant and nuanced surgery can provide patients in need. They understand that. And then there are those who are just like, I don't want to deal with insurance. I can now call myself a surgeon. People want hair. I'm going to get into this and chop away. And this is my perspective, and this is just my opinion. In my opinion, the majority of members of the ISHRS are the latter. They are people who saw an opportunity, didn't know what direction they wanted to go in, maybe in medicine, or just were tired of what they were doing, and they decided to get into this because they thought it was easy. If the ISHRS created real standards, they would have no organization. So they can't even have a trade organization if they created these standards because the majority of the physicians who are members and paying their dues, can't meet these standards or are unwilling to do it. It's too hard.
But you do recognize, Spencer, that there really isn't anyone in the hair world that went to medical school and said, I'm going to become a hair surgeon. It's every single hair surgeon got there through a circuitous route.
Absolutely. There are maybe 3 that I know of who decided to become dermatologists, but they had in mind that they wanted to become a hair surgeon. One recently passed away. So you're absolutely right about that. But with that said, there's a group of guys, I believe, who've decided to get into this specialty. Yes, they want to make some money. Yes, they realize this is something that could be, they can make their own hours. They don't have to worry about being on call, all that great stuff. It's cosmetic surgery, but they also suffer with hair loss. They may have had a bad hair transplant sometime down the line, and they wanted to improve people's lives. And there are people out there who are like that. And there's also people who also understand the real value of this surgery to people. And they're not just trying to run a chop shop. So I guess my point is there are good people good doctors who really would like to have a more standardized industry. And then there are those who would prefer to fly under the radar and don't really want any, bright lights shined in any corners of the recesses of this field, and essentially be left to their own devices to do what they want to do. Hire their own staff, use per diem techs, whatever they need to do. So you asked me, do I blame the professionals in the field or the so-called leaders in the field? Yeah, I mean, I think there was a lot of opportunities, especially early on when I started, to really create standards, which I tried to create. And sadly, the politicians in the field looked at what I was doing as competition, as opposed to something that was really an opportunity to evolve this field into, I think, the medical specialty that, and again, elegant, nuanced medical specialty that it is. So, yeah, I mean, that's a tough question for me because I tried several times. 2008, we put out a neograft warning to the industry and to the public. Not about the device itself, but what this was going to do to the industry. And I never forget, the president of the ISHRS at the time saw I was interviewing Alan Bauman online, and we went live. And at the time, we were getting a lot of big numbers live. And he said to me, this is really interesting. I never thought of it this way, but you're right. There's going to be a lot of non-core people in this field getting involved in the field now and using technicians. What do you suggest we do? I took the time to write a list of suggestions how we could essentially deal with this. And he comes back to me and says, well, I spoke to the other people at the ISHRS, the board members, and they're concerned about lawsuits, so we're not going to do anything. I'm like, all right, that's just the nature of the game, and I knew that. So I always realized that I was kind of on my own trying to provide the truth to consumers. And then in the end, there's a lot of doctors who will just say, and your colleagues probably told you this too, they put their heads down. They're like, well, I'm doing great work, so that's all that matters. And even at these meetings, you see them in the hallways, they're patting each other on the back. And then when you walk, to the bar with them, they start talking shit about their colleagues and, what bad work they're doing. It's kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, there's a mixed bag, absolutely. But there's still I do see that the standards are being pushed forward. Maybe not at the rate that they should have been pushed forward. Maybe if those policies you were proposing back in 2008 had been greenlighted, maybe the quality of work, the standardization of a lot of these clinics would have been much more progressed forward. But I do think there are some amazing hair surgeons around the world that are self-motivated to make sure that their practices are at the highest standards.
100%.
And I think, what you're doing, Spencer, even coming back and restarting your show, you're dispelling a lot of the bullshit that's out there, and you're saving a lot of patients from being harmed, essentially. But it's a challenge. You bring up a very good point. It's a challenge because the internet is inundated with a lot of crap, and we're fighting against this crap that's being pushed in front of people's faces. So
yeah, listen, I've watched some of your stuff, and I could see that you have a really open attitude, and just having me on the show as a physician in this field, I mean, that's a big deal, because when we first connected, I said, look, as long as I can tell the truth, I'm in. And you're like, that's exactly what I want. There are physicians who have been online for a long time who, once I kind of propose that to them, I don't hear back from them. It's pretty interesting. And, I want consumers to know, and I call them consumers, I mean patients, potential patients to know, hair transplant consumers to know that there are great doctors out there. And not every great doctor has applied to the International Alliance of Hair Restoration Surgeons. That's important too. What I tell people about my organization is that it's a great place to start to do your research. And while we've had over 3,000 applicants in over 20 years. We rejected most people. They can't just pay dues and be a part of it. There are plenty of doctors out there that have not applied to the organization who are probably doing incredible work I don't even know about. And that's also part of, the industry is growing very quickly as well. So there's new guys getting into it all the time. I would love some younger guys, and they're starting to apply now that I'm online and they're seeing what I'm doing. We have a lot of applications, actually. It's kind of, we've been inundated, that causes me a level of stress too, because people don't like to be rejected either. I'd love to just take their dues, but we can't do it. But I just want consumers to know that if they find me and they find my resources, we don't do online consultations. We're not selling surgery. My mantra is surgery is a last resort. But there's also doctors outside of our group that are doing great work. They just haven't applied to the group, so it's hard for me to.
So back to my original question. What are the steps that someone should take to get started on this journey?
First of all,
what should they be looking for? What qualifications? What should they be listening to?
Okay, well, look, I don't want to sound like I'm selling the organization, but it's easy for me to say that doctors should be
But that's okay because you're setting the standards to be this high, okay, and you're rejecting a lot of people because they're not meeting those qualifications. That's okay for you to promote that.
Well, I appreciate that. Sometimes I just don't like to come off as self-promotional, especially like I said, there's doctors. It could be 100. I don't know how many doctors are out there who have not applied to the group that should be a part of things, who are doing great work. But what I would normally tell someone is, there's an article that I wrote for WebMD that's still, it's incredibly popular, and they keep redoing it every couple of years. And essentially it talks about the different standards out there, what the meaning of every organization is, what the meaning of being board certified in hair transplant surgery is by the ABHRS, and what the ISHRS is, and what being a fellow of the ISHRS means. And I think these are all decent qualifications. But I think it's important for people to understand what all of these letters mean when they start to do their research as well. So first, understand what these organizations are, and don't just go by letters and thinking that just because someone is carrying a seal or someone is part of a certain website that they're qualified, because it doesn't necessarily being a part of these trade organizations doesn't necessarily make them qualified to be a great hair transplant surgeon. I think it's really important to have in-person consultations when possible. If you can't have an in-person consultation, at the very least, when you have your online consultation, ask the physician how many cases they've performed. To be a part of the IHRS, it's a minimum caseload of 500 on their own, and no one has ever set that standard before. Now, I think some organizations are trying to set more of a time on tissue standard. But, after 500 surgeries, all the mistakes have already come through your door. You kind of understand what's been going on with your patients, and through trial and error. Hopefully not too many mistakes have come through your door. So I tell people, make sure they have a lot of cases under their belt. Find out if they've had an internship or pre-ternship, which isn't necessarily, isn't necessary to be a great hair transplant surgeon, but it certainly helps. You need to be trained somehow. And how were they trained? Since this is not an actual recognized specialty, like you said, no one's going to medical school to do a residency in hair transplant surgery and to become a hair transplant surgeon. It's not easy to get well educated in this and to get enough time on tissue to hang up a shingle and actually say that you are a specialist at this. So try to get what their background is. I also think it's important for patients to understand that this is a team effort in most cases. So the staff is very important. The technicians that are used or the PAs that are used in your surgery help to dictate the final outcome of your surgery. So you might want to understand how long they've been working with the doctor that you're considering and, what their qualifications are. And you have to, I think, meeting and speaking with patients is really a great way to get information. And you want to speak with patients, if possible, who have similar hair characteristics, skin characteristics, etc. So you can at least get an idea of what you may look like after the procedure. But that's a lot of work. That's not the way it's done today. The way it's done today is someone sees an ad online, they try to figure out, the cost of it. They may call up a clinic and, set up a free online consultation or even an in-person consultation. And then a lot of doctors will have salesmen. There's a lot of confusion. So for me to put out all the steps, I can tell you that I can guarantee that most people in today's market won't take all the steps needed to make a truly informed decision. That's why it's easier for me to say, at the very least, start to do your research at iahrs.org, and then at least they have a fighting chance of making a reasonable decision.
I actually believe you're making a bigger impact than they are, because you're fighting against the stuff, the crap that's out there.
Well,
I'll be honest with you.
Well, I appreciate that. I don't mean to interrupt you, but the IAHRS is our organization. So I tell people,
okay.
Very least start with the iahrs.org. At least you have a fighting chance of making a good decision, even if you decide just to have an online consultation, which I don't think patients should do. If it were me, I have to sit down and talk to the doctor. I have to see what their facilities look like, their staff, and meet patients. At least a handful, or at least speak to them on the phone. Now, you're never going to meet their worst cases, but at the very least, you can see their best cases, what they're capable of performing. And people just don't take the time to do that. Just before and afters, it's the same stuff. But I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just wanted you to know that I was talking about the IAHRS.
Sorry, the acronyms sometimes,
I get it.
Yeah. But I do think what you're doing is it's very admirable, and I would encourage you to keep doing it. You inspire me to go out there and dispel a lot of information and be as honest, as brutally honest as I possibly can, because at the end of the day, I want to make sure that patients are informed and make the right decision. And I'll be completely honest with you. I've had numerous male patients reach out to me who were thinking about going to Turkey, had complications, and I just said, hey, you're too young. You can't have a transplant. So I think there's a lot of things that I learned from this conversation, and I really hope that anyone who listened, really understands that when you go for a hair transplant, it's a big deal. Take a pause, do your research, check out Spencer's podcast, The Bold Truth, and his organizations, because you really want to make an informed decision. You don't want to have complications from the surgery, and it's better to go slower than trying to race to the end and trying to restore your hair overnight. You really got to do your research, because there's a lot of, unfortunately, there's a tremendous amount of misinformation out there. So I wanted to thank you so much, Spencer, for taking the time to have a real conversation with me today.
I hope that this helps whoever's listening and whoever's watching your podcast. And I appreciate you doing what you're doing. There are, like I said, there's a few doctors who may be putting themselves out there, creating content that's completely honest and forthright. It's hard to find, brother. It's really hard to find. So just keep doing what you're doing. And, if you ever need me, I'm around.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here.
I hope that you enjoyed this episode. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. Make sure to hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to listen to the next episode.